Hey everyone, good evening. It's Ellen Lewis from Crazy for You. And thank you so much for joining me. Hey Amelia. Hi Barbara. It's nice to have you. So I'm excited. I think this is going to be a really good session. If you follow me and subscribe to the newsletter, I talked about this a little bit in the last newsletter, and it is about all of the different construction methods that there are for yarn, right? Hey, Amy. So tell me in the chat if this has ever confused you. There are a couple different terms. So, you have modern construction or new construction or whatever. It sounds more like you're building a house than you're making yarn, right? But back in the day, there was only one way to make yarn. But, with all of the technological advancements that there have been in all sorts of things, there are so many different ways, new ways to make yarn. Well, not so many. I guess there are three new ways. There's the old way and three new ways. And I want to share those with you tonight. So, like I said, the first way that yarn was made was simply twisting the raw fleece that comes off of the animal after it's been cleaned and carded and combed. They simply twisted it, and that added strength to it. So they twisted it, and then they twisted it with another strand that was twisted, and that was called plying. And for hundreds of years, that was pretty much the way yarn came. And there are so many things that I could say about plied yarn and the difference between single ply and two ply and three ply and four ply and more ply. That would fill an entire podcast all by itself. And I may do that sometime, but this is really just about the difference between plied and the other kinds of yarn. So if that's good with you, let's get to it. Hi, Susan. Hey, Amy. Hey, Gwen. Hey, Terry. Hey, Sandy. Nice to see you guys. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my my thing here. Hi, Evelyn. Okay, so when we talk about plied yarn, it can be as simple as, like I said, a single twist of yarn. So this little piece is probably easier to see. See how it's just sort of fat, and all they've done is twist that. So they call that a single, right? It hasn't been plied with anything else. And it pretty much knits up like this. That's what we're used to seeing when we look at knitting, right? This is a real evenly spun, relatively speaking, pretty smooth, pretty even. You see that? And this is a little more uneven. This is a Noro, but still a single. And it knits up like this, right? It's a little uneven, but that a lot of that evens out in the blocking. But this surface is pretty standard, what we're accustomed to. So one ply, here's a two ply yarn. You can have two plies where it's been twisted with another yarn. If you read the newsletter, then you know that ply is related to the French plier, which means to bend. And it's the same root word that you have with pliers and all this other stuff, because originally when they plied the yarn, they just twisted it back on itself. So they bent it back over. I thought that was kind of interesting because I'm a language nerd. Anyway, back to the yarn. Okay, so, and you might also have a yarn that has lots and lots of plies. Here's this one. You can see that it has 6 different strands that go into it. And it knits up like this. And this is probably what you think of when you think of yarn and when you think of knitting. Just this kind of fabric, right? So what those characteristics and the way the yarn looks it's interesting because the more textured the yarn, the more textured the fabric, whether the yarn is plied or whether it's one of these other constructions. So it's not really any different with these other kinds of constructions. Like I said, if it's very smooth and they've done the modern construction very smoothly, the surface of the fabric is going to look really, really smooth. So what are the other methods? The first one I want to talk about is a chain construction or a chainette. And you've probably seen this a lot. It is a newer way to make yarn, but basically what they've done is they have created a little like a crochet chain or even a little I-cord, if you will, of a finer strand. So they've taken a strand of yarn and rather than twisting it with other yarns, they have made a crochet chain or a little knitted tube. So let's look at what that might look like. Okay, so here is a simple to see example of a chainette yarn. Can you see? It might be easier to see if I show you up here. Hang on. I've been struggling with this camera. Can you see how that looks like a little bit like a crochet chain, like the fiber's already been knitted, right? And if you kind of undo it, you can unknit it. Not this one because it's sort of fuzzy, but for the most part, you can sort of unknit it. Let me try this again. But you know, when you work it up, you don't really see that characteristic in it. At least I don't think you do. Let me show you if I can get this to focus on. Can you see how that looks like a crochet chain or a little knitted tube? Anyway, and this is how this one looks like. And this is a kind of an Aran weight version of it. This is Juniper Moon 14. This is Merino Aria by Rowan. Same kind of thing. You've got that chain in the yarn, but the surface of the knitted fabric is still really smooth. It doesn't, to me, look that different than the yarn that's plied. Here's another example. This is Katya Cosmopolitan, and this is a rayon yarn. Again, it's a little chain. It has a little sparkle worked in with it. But you can see that it is a chain. This is an example of a lot of little stitches that go in to make that tube of yarn. Do you see how each stitch is really sort of tiny and it makes this tiny little I-cord? And this is how it knits up. So the surface of it is very, very smooth. All right. So why chainette? Why would they make it? What's the point? What's it like? So a chainette, because it's like a crochet chain or a little I-cord, it's very elastic. Okay. So a yarn like this one that's rayon, it doesn't have a lot of inherent elasticity to it. But when you construct it with this method, you can see that it has much more elasticity than it would if it were not made in this way. Let me see if I can show you this way too. Do you see how it stretches? So it's a way of giving a fairly inelastic fiber a lot more stretch. But what if you already have a fairly elastic fiber like wool? This is a cashmere and wool blend. Then you get quite a bit of stretch. So do you see how elastic and stretchy this particular fiber is? Same with this one. This is a merino, which is already kind of stretchy, very stretchy here. And there are a lot of details about how much stretch you can get based on how long the chains are and how many there are and whatnot. But it definitely enhances the amount of stretch. This is another one right here. This is Shibui Rain, which is 100% mercerized cotton, which isn't a very stretchy yarn at all. And this particular version of Chainette, they haven't really been able to get a whole lot of additional stretch, but you can feel that there actually is. And this yarn has kind of a texture to it. Can you see that? And when it knits up, I actually knit a sweater in the rain. It has a little bit of a surface texture to it. All right. One more example I want to share with you. This is Rowan cotton wool. Can you see that that is a chainette? You have to look pretty close because this has been brushed a little bit as well, but you can see that, if my camera would let you, can see that little bit of a chain construction in there. And it definitely has a little more stretch than maybe a plain cotton and wool would have. And because it's so smooth, the fiber is so smooth, the surface texture of the fabric that you knit with it is very, very smooth. All right, so what does a chainette construction mean to you when you're knitting? First thing you need to know is that because it's so elastic, you probably need a larger needle when you are knitting with it. So if you've got like a like this one, this is recommended to be knit at about 14 stitches over 4 inches, which, you know, for many of us is going to require about a 10.5. I needed an 11 needle, which is actually 2 sizes larger than a 10.5 in terms of millimeters, to get the right gauge, because the yarn is so elastic that as you're knitting with it, it's going to stretch over the needle. And then when it's off the needle and in the fabric, it's going to collapse back in. And if you use a needle that's the size that you think is required for that gauge, you're going to end up too tight. So one thing to remember if you are working with a chainette construction is that you need to use a larger needle size. The other reason that I think chainettes came along is because they're very light. So rather than having all of that ply, all of that fiber densely through, so a plied yarn is consistent from, you know, if you were to cut it and see the cross section of it, it would look pretty much the same all the way through, and it would be solid yarn, solid fiber. But with a chainette construction, because it's a chain, you have all of that air in there. So it's much, much lighter than an equivalent length of yarn. So that's something to think about too when you're looking at a pattern that has been written for a particular kind of yarn that maybe is a chainette, and you're thinking about substituting a plied yarn for it. You can get the gauge and you can match the yardage, but the weight of the garment in the plied yarn is going to be much higher than the weight of the garment in the chainette. So that's just a long way of saying that chainette yarns are lighter than plied yarns. Plied yarns are the heaviest of all. Does that make sense? Tell me in the comments if you already knew this or if this is, you know, helpful or interesting to you. Okay, so those are chainette yarns or chain yarns. And if you see them in the shop or you see them online or you see them somewhere, just remember that the greater the texture of the yarn and the easier for you to see the chain construction, the more texture you're going to have in your resulting fabric. So if you have a lot of fancy stitches, you might lose them in a very highly textured chainette construction. None of the ones that I have shown tonight are very highly textured. I do have one that I'll show you. Ooh, crinkle, crinkle. And that is this. Let me show you this. This is a fairly highly textured chainette, and it would give you a lot of texture on the surface of your fabric. So it might be best in stockinette or something like that. But again, you would have to check it and see for yourself. All right, let's see. Oh, good. I'm glad that was helpful. Okay, Phyllis is asking a question. Which one is warmer? Wow. I'm not sure. I mean, I think when you have something that traps a lot of air, you know, you could have something that's very warm, but there's also something to be said for the idea that it's, you know, it allows airflow in and out. The cotton wool garment that I knit is called Contentment, and a bunch of us knit it. And it doesn't feel very warm. It feels light, and it doesn't feel, you know, particularly heavy and cozy. I think some of it's going to have to do with how brushed it is and how much air it's able to trap. That's a really good question, and I haven't thought too much about which is warmer. You know, some of it I think also is going to have to do with the fabric itself, which, you know, wool, if it's a wool chainette, that's going to be warmer than a cotton chainette. And a wool chainette is going to be warmer than a cotton plied. Do you know what I'm saying? So I think it maybe has more to do with the fiber itself. Janice says she thinks the chain would be warmer. What does Amelia think? Probably, yeah, that too. So I think there are a lot of factors that go into warmth. So how tightly you knit it, as Amelia points out, how dense the fabric is, how thick it is, all factors to be considered. Okay, so that's a chainette construction. The next one I want to talk about is a tube construction or a blown construction. Rita was about Contentment is not warm, but I found it very comfy. Yes. So yeah, Rita had knit that same sweater, and it's not warm, but it's soft against your skin. And you know, it's interesting because it was in a summer book. You know, we were all doing it. It was part of the Kim Hargrave's Drift collection. So really pretty and a nice transitional. So if you're looking for something for mid-December, that might not be your garment. But I consider it, for here in the mid-Atlantic, I consider it to be kind of an all year round, because, you know, I'm not in Vermont. I don't need it to be that warm for me. Okay, so let's talk about tube yarns or blown yarns. Have you heard of these? Have you seen these? Can you recognize these? Tell me in the chat. I love these, actually. These are even lighter than the chain. So what a tube construction is, they've actually taken a very, very, very fine yarn, and they've constructed a thin tube, and then they've blown other fibers in there. So what we carry in the shop, you either have a cotton, silk, or cotton silk. That's what I have, cotton or silk tube. But they can have merino fibers blown in there. They can have alpaca fibers blown in there. You could have cashmere fibers blown in there. Cashmere, merino, alpaca. That's what I'm going to show you today. So these are really beautiful yarns. They confuse me, but I love them. Which ones confuse you? Everything? Tell me. Trying to remember. I think I've used... Yeah, I think maybe you have, Amelia. And when I talk about these different ones, it might ring a bell for you. So hang on. Okay, so the first one that I ever carried in the shop was this one, which is cotton merino. This is a Katia yarn. And if you look at it, you can see that, you see that tiny tube? My camera doesn't always want to focus the way I want it to. There. So I don't know whether they dye the whole thing at the same time, or whether they dye the yarn that they use to make the little tube first and then they dye the fibers. I really have no idea. But in this instance, the cotton of the tube and the fibers blown inside have taken the dye differently. So you get this beautiful effect. Let me show you on the DSLR camera. I think this might be nicer. Can you see this effect on the yarn? It's, I don't know what it is. It's almost magical looking, I think. And you can see here can you see the tube of it? Whoop. No, showing my face. There we go. Yeah. So in this instance, like I said, the tube is sort of like a pale green and the fiber inside is dark, and it's very, very pretty. This is what it looks like in the ball. And it's sort of hard to know what it's going to look like when you knit it up, but here's what it looks like. And you can play with it a lot and get a different effect. So here's a sweater I knit in a different colorway of the same yarn. And in this instance, you can see that the tube is kind of a red and the fiber that they've blown inside is black. Can you see this? Let me show it up here. Can you see this fabric? I think this is a really gorgeous, gorgeous kind of fabric. So you can really play with that and get some kind of magical variances and color work in there. You know, sometimes the tube is white, sometimes and the fiber blown in is dyed, and sometimes the tube is black, and you know, so you get this interplay of the colors. Tube yarns are light. They are so much lighter even than the Chainette construction yarns, because that tube is a very fine yarn. And then you just have this fluff in there that weighs almost nothing. So let me share with you a couple others of these. Okay, this is a beautiful yarn. This is called Grace. And in this instance, they've used a silk fiber for the tube, and cashmere is blown inside. So that is really, really luxe. Yeah, this is gorgeous. And it like I said, it weighs almost nothing. This one, I think, is really every bit as nice as the cashmere and silk. This is alpaca and silk. You can see in this instance that you can see the chain fairly visibly in the yarn. And then you see that kind of like little halo around it. My camera gets tired of focusing. You see how you can see the fibers that are sort of poking through that chain, or that tube. And this is what it looks like in the ball. But, you know, knitted up, it looks rather different. It has a very soft halo to it and very cozy. I think this is gorgeous. I love this yarn. Another example of this construction of yarn that you've seen, I'm sure, many times is Rowan Alpaca Classic. And this is a very, very fine version. So this is a sport weight yarn, and the tube is cotton, and they have blown alpaca into it. But it's so fine that you really can't identify what's going on quite as well. But you can see that the fibers are sort of poking out, giving you, in your knitted fabric, a beautiful soft hand and halo. Gorgeous, gorgeous stuff. So that is a tube construction. And when you look at yarn, or when you're thinking about it, if you want to identify it, look for that little knitted tube, okay? And then see the fibers in there. And it will usually have some even split on the fiber content. So there'll be like cotton and alpaca, which is the blend for Alpaca Classic, or silk and alpaca. All right. So that's one sort of trick to see if it is a tube yarn. Okay, so the last kind is called an air jet spun yarn. And this is probably the newest innovation in yarn, perfected really only in the last 50 or 60 years. So this yarn is constructed by taking a thin strand of yarn, a core of already spun yarn, and then they have a tube. I don't know how big it is. I'm sure it's small. And they blow air into that. And when the air hits the wall of the tube, it starts to spin around. It bounces. And they introduce the fiber into that fast jet of air. And what happens is the fibers cling to the core yarn, and they twist because the air is swirling around. So super cool, I think. That is, when you look at it, it looks almost like a single ply, but you can't really untwist it the way you would a single ply. So it's probably the latest innovation in yarn that you're likely to see. And I haven't seen a ton of it. Those of you who remember or made the No Plain Jane sweater from Wool Addicts, that yarn Air is an air jet spun yarn. And I have a couple samples of it here. So let me show this to you. Let's see. Amy had a question. What brand is that blue alpaca? Isn't that gorgeous? That is Illimani. I have every color in the shop. It is on my list. I am going to make my next sweater out of it. So join me if you will. Hi, Vicki. Nice to see you. Let's see. Seems like, yeah. So the air jet make it stronger? Yeah, I think so. So let me share with you a couple of these. Okay, so this is actually Wool Addicts Air, which many of you probably remember. Can you see how it looks like a spun yarn, but you can't untwist it really. It's all kind of in there. Hard to, here's another one. This is a little bulkier. And the thing about the air jet spun is the surface, the texture of it is always going to be slightly uneven. Right? In the same way that a single ply is slightly uneven. There isn't any way for it to kind of balance itself out. But it does make a really pleasing texture. It's very squishy, very soft, very smooth. And I find it does resist pilling. As I said, I knit a sweater, 2 sweaters out of it, and I've been very happy with them. Let me share those with you. So the first one that I ever knit with this kind of yarn is the No Plain Jane. And I've had this, 4 years? And I wear it a lot. And it really doesn't pill. Let me see if I can show you here. So it's sort of hard to tell, but you would think that for a sweater that I've had and worn this much, it would look kind of a mess, but it doesn't. It really doesn't pill that much. So I believe that the air jet yarn is a very durable kind of yarn. So this is an example of it. And also I knit a coconut sweater in that air, same yarn. And again, I've had this a long time, and I always think about yarns and sweaters. I always check under the arms because that's when you wear sweaters, if they're going to pill, that's where that's going to happen. And as long as I've had this and as many times as I've worn it, I haven't had any pilling in the underarm area or any place. So as far as durability, it's a very, very durable construction method. And I'm interested in seeing it evolve. So I think other yarn companies will probably move into that. I did a lot of research on it. So it originally started as a commercial application, and they were doing it with monofilament, which is like polyester, any kind of what's the polymer, and they were using it for cables and other kinds of things because it is so strong and durable, and they could create it very quickly with a lot of force. And then they just discovered that certain characteristics, if they used a staple yarn as the core, and then they blew in the staple fibers of staple like cotton or animal fibers or linen, that it adhered and it made this yarn. So I think it was something of an accident that it entered the hand knitting market, but I do really like it. I like all of these constructions, and my point in making this is simply to show you that each of the construction methods has its own benefits in terms of lightness and durability and all of that. But the fabric that you get doesn't look all that different. So if you see a yarn in the shop or someplace that looks like it doesn't look familiar to you, it's not a standard plied yarn, ask and see if there isn't something knit up in that so you can see what the fabric looks like, because they really do kind of create a similar fabric in the end. So I would be interested in any of your thoughts on this. If you have a question or a comment, please go ahead and put it in there. I answer all my comments. And I hope that this has been useful for you. If you enjoy it and you're not already subscribed, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and I will see you next time. Thanks so much for joining me. Good night.